Good day, I'm Dr. T. Welcome to my office. So in this video, I want to jump into the world of the philosophy of science. And you're probably thinking one of two questions. First, why? And second, wait, isn't that like a really big topic? And the answer is yes. Okay, so why do I want to dive into this? Remember, this course is focused on K-12 educators. Or future K-12 educators mostly. As such, you know, y'all might be teaching this stuff. So it's helpful to have a little bit of a context as to what you're teaching. Quite often we teach science as very much just a list of facts, which there's reasons, but there's more than a list of facts, and that creates kind of a weird relationship that we have as a society with science. So actually understanding what we're doing is definitely quite helpful. Also, a lot of state standards are going to have things such as, you know, students will understand concepts in science and engineering methods. So something like that. So this is potentially part of the standards, although I'm going to go way past what I assume most states are going to require their middle schoolers to know. Because if you understand this at a deeper level, it's definitely helpful if you're going to try and teach something. Or just helpful for life. So hopefully this is useful. The other part is that this is a very big topic. There are multiple books written on this topic. So you can find quite a few. I'll suggest, you know, one or two, but I'm going to be packing a whole lot into hopefully an hour-long video, maybe. We'll see. I hope I can cram it into an hour. Probably should stop talking about the video and get talking about philosophy of science. So with that said, let me jump into some future reading and then we'll jump into the actual topics. So the first book I'd like to recommend is The Structures of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn. This one is basically his argument on how science works, and this is going to kind of make up a lot of kind of the middle part of this video. It is an older book. It comes from the late 1950s, early 1960s, and it definitely reads like that. So just giving you a heads up, it doesn't really talk about technology much, which I'm going to add in my thoughts on technology, which is kind of understandable. You know, I'm a child of the 90s, technically the 80s, and things had changed a lot in, you know, the late 20th century, early 21st, compared to the mid. But also, as you're reading through it, you know, he does use highly gendered language. He assumes all scientists are guys, kind of thing, which in 1962, I understand why, but, you know, it ain't 1962 anymore. So just giving you a heads up, it does feel like a very old book. A much newer book that I also like is The Things We Make, The Unknown History of Invention from Cathedrals to Soda Cans by Bill Hammack. This is not a history of science. This is actually very much definitely not a history of science. It is making an argument that engineering predates and is different than science, and that engineering uses science just like the arts use science. And that engineering is maybe closer to an art than a science. But I think gives it a really nice representation of how science and engineering fit into our society. We tend to lump them together, but they are two separate things. They're similar. They have a lot of math. But they are different, and then they fit into how our society works. So it's a really nice review. And then Bill Hammack is a fairly famous engineering educator, having a YouTube channel as well as a long history before the YouTube channel. So check out his YouTube channel. It has like a whole companion series of videos that are really good. Okay, so now actually diving into our focus questions and into the actual content of this module. So I want to start by discussing epistemology. Yeah, we're going to talk about science by jumping first to philosophy, because keep in mind, the sciences were originally, you know, framed as natural philosophy. We evolved out of philosophy. And the study of epistemology is basically the philosophical study. I don't even know what terms to use. I'm not a philosopher. I mean, I got a PhD, but so technically I'm a philosopher, but you know what I mean. I'm a scientist. But epistemology is the branch of philosophy that deals with how do we know what is true. And there are multiple different epistemologies. Basically, what is our understanding? What is our framework for what is true. Now, there are two kind of branches of epistemology that I want to look at because I think they're most relevant to what we're discussing. First is rationalism, and this one is actually fairly old. We usually give a lot of flack to the medieval thinkers, but they were very much into pure logic and reasoning their way through things. And this ends up becoming what we call rationalism, championed by individuals such as Descartes, where this like mathematical level of logic, just absolute pure logic, is how you know things are true. There's another epistemology that ends up coming out. This is championed by individuals such as Sir Francis Bacon, and it's known as empiricism. Basically, the source of truth is what you see around us. And so by experimentation and testing, we can find what is true. And as you can probably guess, science is built on an empiricistic worldview. We are using the epistemology of empiricism. I don't care how good my logic is, if it doesn't match up with reality, then I must be wrong. And this creates almost a very cutthroat philosophy, or almost this cutthroat way of thinking, where it's like, I like my ideas, but my ideas can't be precious. If they're too precious, then I'm going to go down weird alleys. And so I have to test my ideas, and I have to kill off my ideas if they don't match reality. Which kind of gets cruel and cold and doesn't feel good, but it generally gets you to some good data. And it's been fairly successful over the last 400 years or so. Now, I'm a chemist, so the birth of science, I always think the birth of chemistry. I'll talk a little bit about chemistry, physics, astronomy towards the end here. But with the birth of chemistry, it's classic, Lord Robert Boyle's The Sceptical Chymist, or The Sceptical Chymist. It's spelled with a Y. And in this book, we quite often, talk about kind of the birth of chemistry, because he is taking these empiricistic, I think that's a verb, ideas from empiricism. So I assume that would be empiricistic. I have no idea. And he is using that as the foundation, and he's using that for an argument. His argument is arguing against the Aristotelian element. As an aside, if you actually look into Aristotle's alchemy, he actually has 5 elements. He doesn't have 4. So if you're making your new young adult adventure story with elemental magic, it's fire, earth, wind, water, and ether, because he assumed everything out in outer space was super magical, not the same stuff as Earth. I mean, wrong on all counts. Pretty much Aristotle in his sciences. But Boyle is making an argument against Aristotle. And while that's important, that's probably the least important part of this book. A lot of the book is how he is doing, not what he's doing, but how he's doing. For starters, it's written in English. It's old-timey, King James-y, Shakespearean-y English, which means you can still read it. Like, it's a pain, but you can totally still read this thing. And so he's writing in English, and this was a big change. This is showing the rise of England as beginning their world dominance. This is still before England is the great empire that rules the world, the sun never setting upon the British Empire. This is before that, but it's definitely as England is becoming ascendant and becoming a world power. And as such, English is replacing Latin as a dominant language of academia. And so this is one of those early sites. But also what he's doing is he's laying out the experiments he's doing. Everything is based on experimentation, which is taking the ideas of Bacon and the other empiricists and running with them. So this is kind of the foundations of science. He's not quite into modern science as we would know it, but he's definitely taking these empiricistic views on how to make an argument. And then, not only is he doing it by experimentation, he's telling you absolutely how he did it. Like, you could still do these experiments. It would involve like a lot of mercury. You probably don't want to, but you could. You can read it, and it gives you enough detail to do it again. And this will lead into modern methods of science that are actually a really big deal that we're going to see here in the near future. Okay, so let's dive into the scientific method. Now, quite often we'll teach younger students a scientific method that looks something like do research, form a prediction of what will happen in an experiment known as a hypothesis, and do the experiment, and then that influences your understanding, or you make a theory or something out of that. And I want to dive into multiple parts of this. But let's start with a hypothesis to begin with. So generally we kind of teach the idea of a hypothesis more or less correct. So if I know what's going on, if I understand how the world works, and if I do this or I observe this, then I should observe or see this other thing. And if I don't, then I need to reframe how my view of the world works. That's fairly good. What we usually don't talk about is that when you create a hypothesis, you actually don't just create a hypothesis. You always create a null hypothesis. A null hypothesis is basically the opposite. It's if I don't understand how the world works and I do this, then I will see this other thing. And the reason we do that is the two hypotheses have to be different. So I can't have a situation where my null hypothesis, the outcome there, is the same as my hypothesis. We say that an experiment has to be able to distinguish between the two. The hypothesis must be falsifiable. You know, the classic example is, what if I have a hypothesis that there are ninjas in the room with me? But they're really good at hiding. So my hypothesis is there's a bunch of ninjas and I can't see them because there are a bunch of ninjas. And then my null hypothesis is there's no ninjas and I can't see them because they aren't there. Okay, they're the exact same hypothesis or they're exact same outcome. So I can't have a situation where my hypothesis and my null hypothesis match because then my experiment doesn't tell me anything. There may or may not be ninjas in my room and I'm just going to have to deal with the fact of not knowing. Unless I can get some new experiments, some other way to sort that out, which I'll get into the role of technology here in a little bit. So that's one of the key areas. Now, the other one, and this gets into a topic known as Bayes' theorem. Just because an experiment indicates my hypothesis is correct or not, it doesn't prove my hypothesis. It just fails to disprove it. What could happen is, one, the experiment is just a mistake. That happens. Alternatively, maybe my hypothesis was not unreasonable, but my null hypothesis wasn't really what the null hypothesis was. Maybe I find ninjas, but they're not actually ninjas, or something like that. So it could be that I think I see something, but I don't. And getting into this, we need to dive into a topic called Bayes' theorem. So in Bayes' theorem, we're looking at the probability that my hypothesis is true versus the null hypothesis is true. And we're comparing that to how well the experiment is at actually getting it right. What's the chance that I'm going to get a false positive or a false negative? You know, a false positive is a situation where it's not true, but my experiment says it's true. And this could easily be it just got it wrong, or it could be triggering off of an alternative hypothesis that I just don't realize. Medicine uses Bayes' theorem a lot, or at least should be. So, you know, if you come in with flu-like symptoms, it could be a dozen different things. So just coming with the symptoms is like, okay, well, you got symptoms that are like the flu, so you have the flu, but there's a high false positive rate where it could be like a billion different diseases. So that's a false positive, also known as a type 1 error. Generally as humans, we are ingrained to kind of do type 1 errors a lot more than the alternative, which is a type 2 or a false negative. Because generally acting on an incorrect assumption is slightly safer than acting, or I should say not acting, on the opposite assumption. So if you think you have the flu, you're going to take several steps. If you have some other disease, well, several of those other steps were probably not unreasonable to take with that disease anyways. So you're better off acting than not. However, as a society, that can lead us down blind alleys, and we start looking for things like the philosopher's stone that just don't exist, and can lead us back to ideas that don't work. And this becomes a major issue with empiricism, where empiricism is definitely focused on, we want to take these things that we believe are true that just aren't, and we want to get these out of our systems. It is better to be ignorant than misinformed. And so Bayes' theorem is looking at your experiment, looking at how likely it makes the false positive, the type 1 error, or alternatively the false negative, the type 2 error, and then mathematically comparing well, what's the probability that a positive result on the test is a true positive or a false positive? And you can run through some statistics. I'm not going to run through that. But you can set up things like a confusion matrix where on one axis you do the actual, the other axis you do the conclusion. You kind of plot out, your true positive, your false negative, that kind of stuff. And this gives you an idea of where you're going with this. And so now we're like, okay, we've got a positive or we've got a negative. We know that's not 100% for sure. But that increases our confidence that the actual is one or the other. What do we do next? Well, the next thing you do is you do a different experiment. Either run the same thing all over again, which if it's just a straight up mistake, if you run it 2, 3, 4 times, hopefully, you don't make the same mistake all the time. This is why whenever we do science, we always do replication. I don't walk in the lab and do one experiment. 3 is a small number of experiments. If it's really big, I'm doing 5, 6, 7. Usually it's an odd number, but I end up doing a bunch. Side note, if you've got students who are doing science fair, tell them to run their experiments in replication. Have them just completely run the whole thing over again like 3 times. That will immediately boost their scores in a science fair. And we're going to do that in the lab. We're just going to do the whole thing completely over again if possible, 2, 3, 4 times, maybe more. And that way we build some confidence. But it's also possible that, the type 1 error or the type 2 error wasn't from a mistake. It was from whatever I'm studying. Maybe it was the mistakes with the null hypothesis. Maybe there's an alternative null hypothesis. So maybe I need to look at a different way because the test I'm using, I think has falsifiability. I think it can distinguish the null from the hypothesis, but maybe it can't because of something I don't understand. And so I use a different test. And so I'm going to replicate my experiments both exactly in kind and then with a different test, ideally. That way, I build my confidence. If everything's coming back positive or everything's coming back negative, then I can build my confidence that it really is positive or really is negative. And if it's coming back all over the place, then I know something's wrong and I need to go figure out what on earth is going on. Because maybe I just opened up something a whole lot more interesting. Maybe the ninjas are messing with my experiment to find the ninjas. Now, replication is absolutely critical. We don't do as much of it as we would like. Ideally, you would have a completely different group of people in another lab in another place do the same experiment over again. But this costs money. It's expensive. And so we have led to what we call the replication crisis. And with that is where we've gotten experiments. We've had these really cool blockbuster experiments that have revolutionized the way we do science. Only 20 years later, discovered they were completely wrong. And we had just wasted 20 years going down a blind alley based off of bad results that we should have replicated. But no one got around to replicating because it's expensive, it's hard work, and let's be honest, do you want to be known as the first person to do something or the second person to do something? It's harder to get money, it's harder to get the street cred for doing the replication. It's absolutely critical, but it's not glamorous. Now, I will actually make an interesting point. This is kind of an aside. When we are doing the falsifiability, I did point out how you always need to be able to distinguish the null hypothesis from the hypothesis. You actually might be coming in a situation where you've got an experiment that's not great. You know it has a really high false positive rate or a really high false negative rate. Those are still useful experiments, especially if it's a high false positive rate. Because if it's high false positive but a low false negative rate, then if it's also an easy, cheap, simple experiment, I'm adding a bunch of ifs on here, but there's definitely experiments like this, then you can run it and you say, well, if it comes back positive, it doesn't tell me much. But if it comes back negative, that tells me a lot. And if it wasn't very expensive and it was a very easy experiment to do, then being able to weed out other possibilities, be able to get that negative result in really early before I do the harder, more expensive, more time-consuming experiments, well, that would be really, really helpful. And so we'll use these as screening experiments. So let's go back to the Skeptical Chymist, and let's look at another one of the things that Robert Boyle does. He writes in plain English. He doesn't encrypt it. Keep in mind, this is a time before intellectual property laws. Intellectual property laws are huge for the sciences. If you want to discover something and you are not incredibly rich where you can just self-fund it, you're going to have to get money from somebody. There's a lot more money if this is an investment, and the only way you make an idea profitable is if you can control it. Otherwise, someone just copies you and, beats you to market. So, generally speaking, at the time, you didn't publish your information in complete detail so that others could replicate it. Because you had to encrypt it. So you had to at least charge a fee to get that one beyond just reading the book. But now we have intellectual property law, and starting with individuals like Boyle, if we're open and we don't hide secrets in there, others who are knowledgeable on the topic can read through the scientific literature that you are writing and can provide feedback. We call this peer review. They're your peers. They're other scientists doing this research, and they can provide feedback to both yourself and to the editor. This way, if a journal is publishing various scientific articles, they're going to get feedback. Hey, this article's great, publish it as is. By the way, that never happens. Or, hey, this article's great, make a couple of changes. That's what you're hoping for. Alternatively, this article's not so good. Or, hey, if this article is based on some wacko idea, don't publish it. And the reason we want to do this is an expert in a very specific topic might understand what the wacko ideas are, or might understand the experiments that appear to be a nice confirmatory experiment, but they're actually a screening experiment. You didn't do a confirmatory experiment to make sure the screening was actually correct. They're going to know this, whereas a scientist in a slightly different field that might value this research wouldn't know that and can't actually evaluate your paper as is. And so you can get some kooky ideas out that most people won't catch. We have seen, especially the last, during COVID, let's be honest, where there were quite a few papers that were published without going through peer review, or kind of a preprint. This became really popular because, of course, we were in the middle of a crisis. We were definitely, highly motivated to understand what was going on. And I think we can all say, looking back, that led to a rather interesting narrative. I don't think the public was really aware of just how much sausage making goes into understanding the scientific process, or just how chaotic science can be. There's a lot of arguments. We don't always know it definitively. You do one study, yeah, that's great, but go back to Bayes' theorem. One study doesn't prove something definitively, especially if it's maybe not the greatest study in the world and it got out without edits. And so hopefully we're able to communicate to the general population that science is a bit messy, like everything else in life. There is disagreements. It's not this very clean-cut, definitive words from on high. It's a messy process. It works, it goes well, but it is definitely a messy process. And that this peer review part is definitely part of this messy process. Now, I want to dive into some of the other parts of the classic scientific method that we teach younger students. Quite often, the first part will be do research on some topic, and then the last part will be form a theory or something like that. Generally speaking, form a theory is a pretty big level, and quite often we don't really talk about theory. We have a certain things that we call theories, but this is one of those distinctions that in the professional setting is not really such a thing. Instead, we kind of clump in together all of our understanding of how the world works as a general topic of called the model. Now, the model would be for a specific topic. And so this would be things like equations and concepts, ideas. Generally what is taught as theory in most, at least most of the K-12 textbooks that I had back in the day. I haven't read them for a long time, so hopefully they're not quite doing it like this. But we in the scientific community usually start talking about the model. Now, we actually might have more than one model. We usually talk about the model when there's more than one of them. And quite often it's a case where it's like, well, this one model, like the billiard ball model of the atom, we know it's wrong, but it's useful. So it's a way of thinking about the world. It's a useful way of thinking about the world. We just know it doesn't actually represent what's real. By the way, that's what we call an instrumentalist view of a model. Like this model, this way of understanding how the world works, doesn't actually describe how the world works, but it's useful. It makes good hypotheses. It gets the job done. So we're going to use it, but we know it's not real. It has some major flaws. Billiard ball model of the atom, way oversimplification. But you know what? It works really good most of the time. And then you have more complicated models, or you have other models potentially that are closer to how the world works. And so we get more into like the Schrodinger model of the atom, in which case, depending on what you're doing, hey, you can have an instrumentalist point of view of, I don't care if it matches how the world works, it just works. Or a realist point of view. And with Schrodinger, I think most of us are going to go fairly realist on that one, where, yeah, it's more complicated, but this is probably closer to how the world actually works. We think our model actually mimics how the world is really working. And of course, hopefully it's going to make better prediction. It's going to be more useful if it actually matches how the world works. So, this kind of leads to kind of the thought of how we teach science. We teach science, basically we teach the model. We don't teach science normally. Most science classes aren't teaching science. They're teaching the model of how we think the world works. And so we sometimes need to step back and go, okay, we're not actually teaching science. We need to teach science, but that's not science. That's the model. That's a part of science. Now, this idea of a model comes from quite a ways back, and this is where I'm going to jump into the work of Thomas Kuhn, where he takes the idea of the model and he kind of expands on it. He says, okay, we've got the model, we all know what the model is, and there's this idea of normal science that he coins, and that is the scientific method that we're normally taught. So like you take the model, and then from the model you form a hypothesis, then you do an experiment on the hypothesis, and the results of that experiment influence and refine and perfect the model. They probably don't completely change the model, though. That's a big change. And if we go back to Bayes' theorem, if you were absolutely certain, if you start out thinking that a certain thing is true and your experiment comes back that it's false, it's not going to completely negate your understanding, because there's a very good chance that that false response from the experiment is actually a false negative. However, it might not be. And so you keep doing the experiments, and they keep coming up false, and they keep coming up false. And eventually you have to come to the realization that every time it comes up false, the likelihood that what you believe is true keeps going down. And at a certain point, you realize you need to scrap the model. And this is where Kuhn starts talking about his paradigm. And he's actually the one who kind of like coins the word paradigm in its modern usage. So it had existed before, but he reframes it where it's the way we do something. This is the way we do business, or the way we do science. In this case, it's the way we do science. And so the model and the normal science, we're refining that model. That's part of this way we do science. And so if the model becomes untenable and we realize we have to change our model, then we're going to go through this chaotic period known as a paradigm shift. And he coins the term paradigm shift in his book, where we have to completely redo how we do things. We have to create a new model. All of a sudden, we have to take a new model of the atom that incorporates the electrons and the protons and the neutrons and photons and whatnot. And we get a new model. Now, once again, we may throw out the old model altogether. We may keep the old model around because it's useful, but we run more on the new model. But then Kuhn points out that that's not the only way that we might do a paradigm shift. We might change the type and the nature of the experiments we're doing, not because our fundamental understanding of the world changed, but maybe it's our values, what I will call the zeitgeist. A zeitgeist is a German word meaning the spirit of the age. And Kuhn spends most of his book arguing that the needs and the values of a society, what I'll call the zeitgeist, do change, and that will change the type of research that's being done. So, for example, back when I was in high school, the area of inorganic chemistry, the study of metals, was viewed very much as a dead science. No one cared about metals. The middle part of the periodic table was more or less boring and purely academic, no practical application. around that same time, nanotechnology started becoming big. Nanotechnology and things like solar cells, they use a lot of elements in the middle of the periodic table. So inorganic chemistry was not dead. It was very hot, still is. Things changed. They changed not because of our understanding of the world. Our understanding of the world didn't change. I mean, it grew and it improved, but it didn't fundamentally change. We didn't throw out a model and replace it. No, instead our values changed, our needs changed. All of a sudden, we really wanted to study nanotechnology and solar cells and stuff like that. Now, Kuhn doesn't talk about technology, but I think that also will change your paradigm. So that is another component of the paradigm, at least that I view as a component of the paradigm. And that is, if the tools you have change, all of a sudden the experiments you can do change. What was an unfalsifiable hypothesis now can very much become falsifiable. If we go back to the ninja example, if all of a sudden I get one of those infrared night glasses, I can now start seeing ninjas. And so I can actually ask that question. I can distinguish my hypothesis from my null hypothesis. An interesting case study I saw on this was back when I was in graduate school. Near the end of it, there was a paper that came out, and I do not remember this paper. Probably one of these years you could try and dig this thing up. But the authors had known that schizophrenia had a genetic component. This had been well known, but no one could find the gene for schizophrenia. It was pretty clear there was not a gene for schizophrenia. And as such, it's kind of hard to actually find a genetic test for it if you don't know what you're testing for. So the author said, oh, forget it. We are going to do a full sequence of 100 people with schizophrenia, 100 people without schizophrenia, and just compare their entire genomes. This was a big deal. This was a big deal because 10, 15 years earlier, we had done the Human Genome Project. Human Genome Project was to find the sequence, the A's, T's, G's, and C's for one person. This was a Herculean effort. This was on the order of work of the pyramids or the moonshots. This was a big deal. And it was for one person. And they said, oh, forget it, we're going to do 200. Well, what had happened was in the intervening time, computers got better, sequence analyzers and the instruments needed to do the work got better and cheaper, just astronomically. Compare 1995 to, say, 2010. A home computer, they're not even in the same ballpark. And so the technology changed, and so the experiments that we could do changed radically and drastically. So this is kind of the idea of the paradigm. And this is one where it might be helpful to let the older students in on this. It's not just hypothesis, experiment, theory. That is normal science. That is a tiny part of the paradigm. Now, I will also point out that Kuhn is not the only philosopher of science, and there are several others with similar ideas or somewhat different ones on how science actually happens. It's one of those things, we've been doing it, we don't quite know what we're doing. We're just kind of winging it along the way. Okay, so we've looked at Kuhn's paradigm. Now, let's jump in and think about how science fits in with greater society. So if we look at Thomas Kuhn's paradigm, we're making the model, we're influenced by the needs and values of society, and I'm adding in, we're influenced by what technology we have. I want to bring in another voice, and that is of Bill Hammack, aka the engineer guy, so an engineering educator, and his book and video series of the same name, The Things We Make. And in that, he describes an engineering method, and his engineering method is solving problems using rules of thumb that cause the best change in a poorly understood situation using the available resources. So he's making an argument that engineering is an ancient profession well before anything we call engineering, and definitely much, much older than science, where they're trying to get stuff done, trying to make the world a better place, and he spends a lot of time discussing, well, what does the word best mean? What are our rules of thumb? What are the available resources? Kind of, there's a lot going on in his engineering method. But one of his commentaries, and one that kind of links him and Kuhn together, is the idea of science creating gold-plated rules of thumb. And his example is the invention of the steam turbine. So using Bill Hammack's engineering method and what I've discussed about the paradigm, go ahead and pause the video and think about a relationship. What is the relationship between the paradigm and the engineering method? Okay, you back? Great. You really back? Okay. So here's my thoughts on this one. Bill Hammack is describing the model very much as the gold-plated rules of thumb. So the better you understand the model, the less poorly understood the situation is, and the better rules of thumb you've got. So science is very much empowering the engineers. And this, we can kind of think and look back at the history of science as making sense of what's going on. We are spending lots of money doing science. We have intellectual property laws that protect the ideas that we create. So if I come up with an invention, then I can sell it and I get a limited term monopoly called a patent on that. And so if I can be an inventor, I can get paid to do invention, and other people will pay me to get a cut of my invention kind of thing. So I can sell my ideas either in advance or afterwards because of these intellectual property laws. And so if I'm, say, doing engineering and I'm making an invention, I might need better rules of thumb. I might need the situation to be less poorly understood. So then myself or the inventors, we can hire somebody to do research onto what I need to know in order to do this. And of course, that person would be a scientist. As scientists, our role is to build the model, not just for the sake of knowledge. The sake of knowledge is nice, but it's not profitable. There's a little bit of money out there for the sake of knowledge. Most of science was the hobby of rich people back in the day. But if we're able to then use that model to make the world better, we can then potentially charge for it and make a bit of a profit. Okay, had to change the battery. So let's talk briefly about how we might think about that relationship between the engineers and the scientists. So if the scientist is responding to the needs of the engineer and refining the model right where it's needed to solve that particular problem, we generally call that applied science. Typically, applied science is done in labs that are affiliated with the engineers that are all being run by the same company who's paying for the whole thing. And that's because if you're paying for it, you get to buy the intellectual property. And so, hey, if the engineer makes a great solution, we can sell the solution, and you know what? We might as well keep the science to that. Now, that is one role of science, is to directly build the model where it's needed to solve the problem, for the engineer to use to solve the problem, and generally to make a bunch of money. But there is an alternative narrative, where sometimes you are building the model, you don't have a problem in mind, or you are a long way off from solving the problem. Quite often it's the latter, long enough that the intellectual property laws are going to expire, so you won't be able to keep that knowledge long enough. We call this pure science or discovery. And in this case, it's quite often not run by for-profit companies, but instead is paid for by governments, and at least in the US is generally done in academic institutions, because you can get double for your money. You can get the science to kind of build up the model that then, once it gets large enough, it's going to get to a point where then scientists at corporations can build that up a little bit more, feed that to the engineers, and they can go make some money off of it. But also, well, in order to train a scientist, they kind of need to do it. And, well, if you're at a university, you got a bunch of students to do the science, to make your science, but also to learn how to do science. So you get science out of it, and you get scientists out of it. I hate to tell you this, if you're a student, you are part of the product as well. We're trying to make future workers as one narrative of what education is doing. So I want to kind of frame that and contextualize it. I do want to talk very briefly about the origins of a couple of the sciences and then kind of wrap up a few areas. This course is going to be kind of at least chemistry, physics, astronomy, maybe some geosciences. I'm only going to touch on chemistry and astronomy. Physics, I'm not going to hit too hard because physics, if you actually look at what physics is, it is a bunch of different disciplines that are almost unrelated. So you've got things like optics and mechanics. They're very different things. Acoustics, very different. So we've got a very complicated origin narrative here. Also, I'm not a physicist, so it's complicated and I'm not steeped in it. Chemistry has a little bit more of a streamlined origin to it. You definitely, the studies of atoms and molecules, etc. There's branches of chemistry, but at least they're all interconnected nicely. And so chemistry starts out, and you can kind of see this narrative for understanding how the world works and then using that to make cool stuff and make money with the history of chemistry. So chemistry starts out as a bunch of different disciplines, pre-scientific disciplines. Of course, you've got alchemy, which alchemy gets a bad rap. A lot of that comes from the very cryptic language. Well, the language was very cryptic because intellectual property laws weren't a thing. And so if people learned what you were doing without giving you money, you ain't getting no money. So if you discovered a new blue dye, the only way to make money off that was to keep your mouth shut and to get someone to give you a bunch of money for the blue dye secret, or to just make the blue dye and not tell anyone how you made it. Nowadays, if you want to make money on the blue dye, you make your new blue dye, you make a patent, and then everyone knows how to make it, but they can't make it unless they get sued, unless they get your permission. And you know how you get my permission? You pay me. So intellectual property law, really a big deal here. The other thing on alchemy is it's, in many respects, what we now call separation science, basically the science of purifying things, or the pre-science of purifying things. The idea was, certain things would have the essence of something else. If you take, wine and you boil it and collect the vapors, you now have the essence of the wine, the brandy, or the this terminology is going to suggest that people had a problem. They probably did. Aqua vita, water of life, is what was distilled spirits, was one of the names that was used in the Middle Ages for, or I should say the Renaissance, for purified ethanol. So you got this idea. You can extract like the essential oils, the things that give the flowers their smell, or the component of the alcoholic beverage that makes it alcoholic. You can purify the alcohol. That was the alchemy. You also had apothecary, which kind of ties into this. Different plants, etc., trying to make people better, the beginnings of pharmacology. Pharmacy and chemistry up until mid-20th century are very much the same field. And you can kind of see this with apothecary going into it. The pharmacists get their lab coats from the chemists. The physicians just stole it from the pharmacists trying to look cool, but the pharmacists and the chemists, we started wearing lab coats to keep weird chemicals off of us, because that was actually a valuable tool. For a clinician, a lab coat's just a liability. They spread germs like crazy. And then we also had metallurgy. Metallurgy stayed more in the engineering families, but metallurgy is the study of metals. And we learned a lot of how atoms work by learning how metals work, because metals are made of atoms. So that ends up being an interesting branch into chemistry. It doesn't merge, doesn't become part of chemistry. Instead, it influences chemistry. And then the last one, which is almost always forgotten, is the dye trade. I don't mean like morticians. I mean like colorful stuff like blue shirts. Because one of the early profitable areas for chemistry, especially synthetic chemistry, where you're making your new chemicals from scratch, or well, from some other chemical, is going to be dyes and pigments. And so we see some early pigments like Prussian blue, but the real blockbuster is William Perkin and mauvine, which he takes literally toxic waste, coal tar, which is a byproduct of illuminating gas, which is actually basically carbon monoxide used for, the old-timey gas lamps. And it would create this coal tar, you extract aniline from it, and then from the aniline he realized you could make a bunch of dyes, and the first one he makes is purple. And of course, if you know the history of purple, purple is historically a horrendously expensive color to make because natural sources are basically non-existent. There's a couple, but they are rare and expensive. And so he comes up with, purple from literal toxic waste. And this all of a sudden makes chemistry go from a bunch of quacks and a bunch of the old weirdo alchemists to very profitable. And, as much as I don't like to admit this, quite often it is all about the Benjamins. Okay, astronomy comes up with a somewhat different source. This is, in many respects, one of the earliest sciences or pre-sciences. Of course, astrology is a major part into astronomy. And the reason why is if you start thinking about looking at the night sky and you start tracing the patterns of stars, etc., what you realize is as the seasons change, as the time of day changes, the location of stars and sun and whatnot in the sky changes, and you can start predicting, well, what season is it? And if you know what season it is, you can predict what animals are going to be walking around, when do you plant, etc. You can also figure out where you are on Earth by looking at the stars. You can do navigation. And of course, you can kind of extend it. If I can figure out what the animals are doing, maybe I can figure out what that rival kingdom over there is going to do. Or maybe I can figure out, if I can know when to plant, maybe I know when to look for one of the ladies, who's going to like me, kind of thing. It makes sense. It's not. Sorry, stars don't tell your destiny. It'd be nice if they did. They don't. But boy, it would be nice if they did. And so a lot of early astronomy is can bank by doing astrology and then doing astronomy on the side. And then as time progresses, realize the astrology just isn't real. But that the astronomy has benefits, such as, hey, if I know where my boat is and I know where the other guy is, I can find a way to get there and I can blow up his boat before he sees me, kind of stuff. If you look at the history of physics, there's a lot of how do I do not nice things to other people or prevent them from doing not nice things to me. Humans are not necessarily a nice species. But this all kind of comes from this general motif of how do I solve practical problems, whether real or imagined? And how does understanding the world work? How does that let me solve the problems that I have? And of course, later on with the invention of intellectual property, then that really helps move into the point of like, well, if I can figure out how to solve a problem, I don't actually have to solve the problem. I can sell my solution to somebody else and then they can solve it and I can get a cut and they can make money and we can all live in a better world. Capitalism works. It's definitely not perfect by a long shot. But, this ends up being built into the concepts of capitalism, which is an interesting narrative when we're thinking about this. Okay, so I have talked for way, way too long. I've killed at least a couple of batteries. So I am going to go ahead and end this video here. I will see you in my next video and have a wonderful day.